My name's Carol, just a regular high school teacher with a love for old books and a quiet life. My world changed when I met David at the school fair. He was the main sponsor, the kind of guy who makes things happen without making a fuss about it. He had that quiet confidence and a smile that could light up the gloomiest day. It started with a thank you note I sent him for his generous contribution. He replied with invitation for coffee, saying it was the least he could do for the hard work we teachers were putting in. I remember walking into that coffee shop, my heart racing a bit, thinking, Carol, it's just coffee, not a moon landing. David was easy to talk to. We chatted about everything, from books to the best pizza in town. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Before we knew it, coffee turned into dinner, and dinners turned into weekends together. A few months in, he wanted me to meet his mother, Mrs. Winters. She's a bit old school, but she'll love you, he said. I was a bundle of nerves, wanting to make a good impression. I picked out my nicest dress and spent more time on my hair than I'd like to admit. The moment we walked into Mrs. Winters' living room, I felt her eyes on me like a hawk. So, you're the teacher David won't stop talking about, she said, her voice colder than I expected. I smiled, reached out for a handshake, but she just nodded, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. Dinner was an experience. Mrs. Winters had this way of talking where every compliment sounded like she was doing you a favor. That's an interesting dress, dear. Vintage shop? She said, her eyebrow raised just so. I felt my cheeks burn, but I managed a small thank you. It's one of my favorites. David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent hang in there, but the digs kept coming. A teacher, huh? Must be tough dealing with kids all day. Hope you don't bring that school discipline home, she chuckled, sipping her wine like it was the last one on earth. I really tried, to keep the conversation light, but it was like dancing on thin ice. David changed the topic, talked about his work, the weather, anything to steer away from the silent judgments being passed across the table. Fast forward a few months, and there I was, in a white dress, saying "I-do" to the man who made it all worth it. The wedding was a blur of laughter, tears, and dancing. Mrs. Winters was there, of course, dressed to the nines and handing out opinions like candy. Lovely ceremony, though I'd have gone for real flowers, not these. What are these, dear plastic? She said, eyeing the decorations. We moved into David's home soon after. It was a beautiful place, cozy and welcoming, except for the chill I felt whenever Mrs. Winters was around. David assured me it would get better, that she just needed time to get used to me. Moving into David's home felt like stepping into a new world, one where every corner held a memory of Mrs. Winters' reign. It wasn't long before I got introduced to her morning ritual, the infamous inspection. It started like clockwork every morning. The minute the clock struck 10, the front door would creak open, and in she'd walk like the queen of her castle. Mrs. Winters had this air about her, like she owned every inch of the place. Her first move was always to slip on those pristine white gloves, snapping them tight like she was about to perform surgery. "Morning, Carol, dear," she'd say, her voice dripping with a sweetness that never reached her eyes. "Just here to help you keep the place up to David's standards." I'd force a smile, my hands clenching the dish towel a bit too tight. "Thanks, Mrs. Winters, but I've got it covered." She'd tut and shake her head, already walking towards the living room. "Nonsense, dear. You're new to this. It takes a keen eye to keep a house like this." And then it'd begin. She'd glide from room to room, that white handkerchief in her hand sweeping over every surface. It was like watching some twisted ballet, her movements precise, calculated. "You see here, dear," she'd say, holding up the handkerchief, now with a faint smudge of dust. "This is what I'm talking about. Can't have David living in a dustbin, can we?" I bit my tongue, the words "it's not a dustbin" sitting at the tip, but I swallowed them down. David had asked me to play nice, and I was trying, really trying. The worst was the kitchen. That's my territory, I love cooking, always have. But she'd march in there like a general, inspecting the troops. "These pots aren't going to clean themselves, dear," she'd cluck, her fingers running over the rim of a saucepan I'd just washed. "It's clean, Mrs. Winters, I'd insist," my voice steady despite the storm inside. She'd hum, a sound that said, "I've heard better jokes." Well, we have different standards, I suppose. David's used to a certain way, you see. I'd nod, grinding my teeth so hard I was afraid I'd chip a tooth. It was the same every day. The living room, the bedrooms, even the bathrooms weren't spared. By the time she'd leave, I'd feel like a deflated balloon, all my energy sapped by her constant nitpicking. David would come home, all smiles and hugs, and I'd put on a brave face. "How was your day, love?" He'd ask, and I'd muster the brightest smile I could. "Oh, you know, the usual." "Mrs. Winters stopped by to give some helpful tips," I'd say, the word helpful taking all my acting skills to sound even remotely sincere. He'd frown, that wrinkle appearing between his brows. "I'll talk to her, Carol. She means, well, she just has her way, you know." I knew. Oh, how I knew. But what I didn't know was how long I could play this game, smiling through the inspections, biting back the words that screamed inside me. Saturday mornings should have been about lazy breakfasts and staying in pajamas till noon. But in our house, they were about one thing, the dreaded family dinner. It wasn't just any dinner. It was the weekly performance, with Mrs. Winters as the stern judge and me. Well, I was the hopeful contestant, always falling short. I'd be up at the crack of dawn, the kitchen my battlefield. Pots and pans clanged, the oven roared, and spices danced in the air. It was my attempt, week after week, to impress the unimpressible. "Mrs. Winters." David, bless his heart, would stumble in half awake. "Need any help, love?" he'd ask, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I'd shoo him away with a spoon covered in sauce. "Go get ready. Your mom will be here any minute, and you know how she is about punctuality." He'd chuckle, a sound that held a mix of love and a hint of worry. "Yeah, if you're on time. You're late. That's her motto." The clock hadn't even struck 6 when we'd hear the sharp rap on the door. Showtime. Mrs. Winters and Mr. Winters would step in, him with his warm smile, her with her eyes already scanning for faults. "Smells good in here, Carol. What's on the menu today?" Mr. Winters would always start off with a compliment, his genuine kindness a stark contrast to his wife. Before I could answer, Mrs. Winters would chime in, her voice slicing through the warmth. "I hope it's not that casserole from last time. Remember, David, how you had that stomach ache?" David would wince, a silent plea in his eyes, begging me not to retort. "Mom, Carol's been working hard all day. Let's just enjoy the meal, yeah?" Dinner would be a tense affair. Mr. Winters would heap praises, his delicious "dear," and "you've outdone yourself, Carol," battling against Mrs. Winters's relentless critique. "This chicken is dry, dear. You really must learn to keep an eye on the oven," she'd say, pushing her barely touched plate away. I'd grit my teeth, forcing a polite, "I'll remember that for next time, Mrs. Winters." David would try to lighten the mood, his jokes a desperate attempt to bridge the widening gap at the table, but it was like throwing pebbles into a chasm, hoping for a bridge. And then, just when I thought I'd survived the worst, dessert would come, and with it, a fresh wave of critiques. "Is this pie supposed to be this? Crunchy?" Mrs. Winters would ask, the word crunchy sounding more like catastrophics. I'd swallow the lump in my throat, my reply a mix of wariness and defiance. "It's a family recipe, Mrs. Winters. It's always a hit." She'd raise an eyebrow, her gaze saying clearer than words, "Not in this family, dear." As they'd leave, Mr. Winters would give me a warm, encouraging hug, whispering, "Don't mind her, Carol. We all love your cooking." But Mrs. Winters's parting words would always be a reminder of the invisible scoreboard where I was always trilling. "Try harder next time, dear. A happy husband is a well-fed husband." The door would close behind them, and I'd stand there, a mix of frustration and defeat simmering inside. David would wrap his arms around me, his silence a mix of apology and solidarity. "It's just one night a week, love. We'll get through this," he'd whisper, his words a lifebuoy in the stormy seas of Saturday dinners. The news of the pregnancy should have been a moment of pure joy, a new chapter for David and me. But amidst the excitement, a shadow lingered, the thought of Mrs. Winters's reaction. David was over the moon, grinning ear to ear. "We're going to be parents. Carol, can you believe it?" he'd say, wrapping me in a hug so tight it felt like nothing could go wrong. But the first time Mrs. Winters dropped by after hearing the news, the air was thick with tension. I braced myself for her words, hoping maybe, just maybe, this new life might soften her. "Well, I do hope you've read up on parenting, Carol. It's not all cooing and cuddling, you know," she started, her tone as sharp as ever. I bit back a sigh, a fake smile plastered on. We're thrilled, Mrs. Winters. And yes, we're reading a lot, getting ready for the baby. She sniffed, peering at me like she was assessing if I was up to the task. Well, make sure you follow the right books. Some of these modern ideas are just nonsense. David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent message of support. But as the weeks turned into months, the pressure didn't ease. Mrs. Winters's visits became a litany of advice and thinly veiled criticism. You're not eating enough greens, Carol. You want the baby to be healthy, don't you? She'd say, eyeing my plate like it was a crime scene. Or make sure you're not being too lazy. Exercise is important, but don't overdo it. You wouldn't want to harm the baby. It was a no-win situation. Do too little and I was careless. Do too much and I was reckless. The breaking point came one quiet afternoon. Mrs. Winters had just left. Her parting words, make sure the nursery is painted soon. You don't want the baby coming home to an unready house, ringing in my ears. David found me in the nursery, the paint samples scatter around, tears streaming down my face. Carol, what's wrong? Talk to me, love, he said, his voice laced with worry. I let it all out. The frustration, the hurt, the exhaustion. I can't do this anymore, David. It's like I'm walking on eggshells in my own home, your mother. It's just too much. David's face hardened, a rare sight. I'll talk to her, Carol. This ends now. You and the baby are my priority. And he did. That evening, I heard hushed, tense voices from the living room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. David was setting boundaries, fighting for our little family. The next day, Mrs. Winters's visits stopped. No more morning inspections, no more veiled insults. It was a relief, yet the silence felt heavy, charged with unsaid words and unresolved tensions. David was quieter, too, his smiles not reaching his eyes. She's my mom, Carol. It hurts, but you and the baby come first. Always? I held him close, the future uncertain but our resolve clear. We were a team, and we'd face whatever came next, together. 7 years flew by since Lily, our little bundle of joy, came into our world. David was a doting father, his love for Lily shining in his every action. My father-in-law, a gentle soul, adored his granddaughter, his face lighting up with every giggle and every new word Lily spoke. But there was a chill that never thawed, a coldness that lingered in the air whenever Mrs. Winters was around. She kept her distance from Lily, her words as sharp as ever. Children should be seen and not heard, she'd say, dismissing Lily's cheerful chatter as nothing more than noise. Lily, with her big heart and innocent eyes, couldn't understand why her grandma wasn't like the ones in her storybooks. She'd try, in her own sweet way, to win over Mrs. Winters. Look, Grandma, I drew this for you, she'd say, holding up a crayon masterpiece. Mrs. Winters would barely glance at it, her voice devoid of warmth. That's nice, dear. Now go play, Grandma's busy. But Lily never lost her spirit. She found her passion early, cooking. The kitchen was her kingdom, her small hands skillfully mixing, stirring, and baking. Every weekend was a new adventure, her culinary creations a source of pride for us. Look, Daddy, I made cookies, she'd exclaim, her face beaming as she presented her latest work. David would scoop her up, his laughter filling the room. Chef Lily, you have outdone yourself. These are delicious. Even my father-in-law couldn't resist Lily's kitchen magic. My little chef, he'd say, his eyes twinkling as he took a bite, you'll be running your own restaurant in no time. Their words were a balm to Lily's soul, a stark contrast to the cold indifference she received from Mrs. Winters. But children have a resilience, a way of focusing on the love they receive, not the affection withheld. One evening, as Lily set the table, her latest culinary creation taking center stage, she looked up at me, her eyes serious. Mom, why doesn't Grandma like my cooking? Doesn't she like food? I knelt beside her, my heart aching with the innocence of her question. Sweetheart, Grandma, she's just different. But your cooking is wonderful, and Daddy and Grandpa and I, we love it. That's what matters, right? Lily nodded, her smile returning, the shadow of Mrs. Winters's indifference brushed aside by the love of those who mattered most. The Christmas invite from Mrs. Winters was a surprise, but Lily's excitement at the chance to showcase her cooking made us accept. Together, we baked gingerbread and apple pie, her little hands working diligently, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Grandma and everyone are gonna love these, right, Mom?" she'd ask, her confidence as warm as the oven. "Absolutely, sweetheart," I'd reassure her, though a part of me dreaded the unpredictable tides of Mrs. Winters's approval. Arriving at the bustling house, we placed our dishes on the grand Christmas table, an array of colors and smells that promised a feast. Lily's face was a picture of joy and anticipation as we mingled, catching up with relatives we hadn't seen in ages. But as we settled at the table, ready to share the meal and the joy of the season, Lily's excitement turned to confusion, then distress. "Mom, where's our gingerbread and pie?" she whispered, her small voice trembling. I scanned the table, a sinking feeling in my stomach. Our dishes were missing. Mrs. Winters at the head of the table was holding court, her laughter ringing out clear and sharp. I approached her, my voice firm but polite. "Mrs. Winters, the dishes Lily and I brought, where are they?" Her laughter cut through the festive hum, cold and piercing. "Oh, those." "I tossed them out, dear. We can't risk serving just anything to our guests, can we?" The room fell silent, the air heavy with shock and disbelief. Lily's eyes filled with tears, her dream of sharing her love through her cooking dashed in an instant. "But I made them for everyone. I worked so hard," she managed to say, her voice a fragile whisper against the weight of her grandmother's harsh words. Mrs. Winters shrugged, her eyes void of any warmth. "Well, dear, not everything made with love is fit for the table. Better safe than sorry." That was the last straw. David, who had always been the bridge between his mother and our family, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor loudly. "Mom, that's cruel. How could you?" he said, his voice steady, but loaded with an anger I had rarely seen in him. "Lily poured her heart into those dishes. She wanted to share something special, and you just threw it away like it was nothing." Mrs. Winters's smile faltered, her eyes widening in surprise. This was not the mild-mannered son she was used to. "David, I was just—" "No, Mom, you went too far. Disrespecting Carol is one thing, but hurting Lily, your own granddaughter, that's something I can't and won't forgive." He interrupted, his disappointment and anger clear and unwavering. The room was still, the festive air replaced by a tense silence. Mrs. Winters sat there, the impact of David's words hitting her. She had expected compliance, maybe a few whispered complaints, but not this. Not her usually gentle son standing up to her, defending his family with such resolve. The air was thick with tension as we left Mrs. Winters's house, the festive lights mocking us with their cheer. The sound of Lily's quiet sobs was louder than the Christmas carols that played in the background. David's hand was firm on my shoulder, a silent pillar of strength. As we reached the door, Mrs. Winters's voice broke through the heavy silence, her tone desperate, a stark contrast to the cold disdain she'd shown earlier. "Please don't go. I'm sorry," she stammered, her eyes wet with tears that seemed out of place on her stern face. David stopped, turning back to face his mother. The room held its breath. "Sorry. Now you're sorry." His voice was low, but it cut through the room, sharp and clear. "You humiliated your own granddaughter, Mom. You broke her heart. There's no sorry that can fix that." Mrs. Winters's sobs grew louder, her composure shattered, but it was too late. The damage was done, and the cracks too deep to mend. In the tense silence that followed, Mr. Winters stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "I can't sit here and pretend this is okay, Martha." "Not this time." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with the burden of a decision long overdue. The room felt colder, the festive warmth snuffed out by a single act of unkindness. One by one, the guests stood up, their faces somber, their goodbyes muted and brief. The festive gathering was unraveling, the threads of family and friendship coming undone. As the last guest left, the door closing with a soft click, the magnitude of what had happened settled in the room. Mrs. Winters sat alone at the table, her sobs the only sound in the house that moments ago was filled with laughter and chatter. Outside, the cold air bit at our cheeks, a stark reminder of the warmth we'd left behind. David's arm was around Lily, her small body leaning into his for comfort. We walked in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us. Back home, as we sat in the living room, the Christmas tree lights twinkling softly, a sense of peace settled over us. It was a fragile peace, one born from the chaos of the night, but it was ours. Lily, nestled between us, her tears dried, but the hurt still fresh in her eyes, looked up and whispered, "Are we okay, Mom, Dad?" David hugged her closer, a silent vow in his embrace. "We're more than okay, sweetheart. We're together, and that's all that matters." And in that moment, as we held each other, the trials of the night receded, leaving behind a simple truth. Family wasn't just about shared blood or shared names. It was about shared love, shared pain, and the shared resolve to stand together when the world seemed to crumble around us. The fallout from that chaotic Christmas dinner rippled through our family like a shockwave. The house felt different, quieter, the air still tinged with the remnants of that night's revelations. David was somber, his usual cheer dimmed by the events that had unfolded. "I'm sorry, Carol," he said one evening as we sat in the living room. The only sound the ticking of the clock. "I should have stood up for you and Lily sooner. I let it go on for too long." I reached for his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against mine. "You did what you thought was best, David. We both did. But now we know better. We move forward, together." He nodded, the lines on his face softening. But the true shock came the next day when Mr. Winters showed up at our doorstep, his eyes weary, a deep frown creasing his forehead. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David opened the door wider, concern etched on his face. "Of course, Dad. Is everything okay?" Mr. Winters took a seat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Christmas," he started, his voice trailing off. We waited, the tension thick in the air. Finally he looked up, his eyes meeting ours. "I can't believe Martha could be so cruel, so heartless to her own granddaughter. I never imagined she could go that far." David shifted in his seat, the weight of his father's words heavy on his shoulders. "Dad, Mr. Winters raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, David, I should have seen it, should have done something sooner. But I didn't, and now I'm thinking about a divorce." The word hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Divorce wasn't a word thrown around lightly in our family, and coming from Mr. Winters, it was a bombshell. "Divorce!" David echoed, disbelief coloring his tone. Mr. Winters nodded, a resolute look on his face. "I can't be with someone who shows such cruelty, not just to Carol and Lily, but to her own family. I've turned a blind eye for too long, hoping things would change. But after what happened at Christmas, I can't ignore it anymore." We sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The decision was monumental, not just for Mr. Winters, but for all of us. It was a line in the sand, a declaration that enough was enough. "Whatever you decide, Dad, we're here for you," David said, his voice firm. "You've always been there for us, and that won't change." Mr. Winters smiled, a weary, sad smile. "Thank you, son. That means more than you know." In the days that followed, our family found a new rhythm, a new way of being. The shadows of the past lingered, but so did the promise of a fresh start, a chance to build something stronger and more resilient from the broken pieces. Lily's laughter returned, filling the house with a warmth that pushed back the darkness. And as we sat together, the three of us with Mr. Winters now a more frequent visitor, I realized that family wasn't about tolerating the intolerable. It was about standing up for each other, about choosing love and respect over blood and tradition. In the quiet moments, when the night wrapped the world in its embrace, I'd look at my little family and know that, despite the storms we'd weathered, we were stronger together. And no amount of cruelty or coldness could ever change that.